I'm going to hopefully welcome Luciano to our stage. If Luciano is there, if not,
thank you, Sue. How are you?
Very good. I think we can hear you. I think your camera may be slightly frozen, but I can hear you loud and clear, Luciano.
Well, let's hope that this internet connection will improve. We will hope experience this sort of hiccups these days. That's one thing that hopefully the future will provide more robustly than it has so far.
Brilliant. Well, let's crack on, because we've got quite a lot that we wanted to kind of pick your brains on, Luciano. And I know we set you a really interesting task to think about what should be on everyone's to-do list for 2021, what should be at the top of people's agendas as we perhaps look out into the year ahead. But perhaps before we get to that, because I'm really fascinated with what's going to be on your to-do list, as I'm sure others are. Perhaps let's just, at the beginning, let's look at a little bit of the past. This is the fourth annual summit that we've held. It's the first time we had a real conversation about this, but it was back in 2016, which feels a long time ago now to me. That time we were talking about, I remember, about the societal impact of AI, the impact on jobs, the impact on work, the importance of trust. So I'm just wondering, with as we kind of look forward, perhaps if for a moment we can just look a little bit back. What do you think we've got, reflecting on where we are right now? What do you think we've got right and wrong in terms of the predictions and the issues we were talking about back then and to today?
Thank you, Sue. So always difficult task to look back and say, oh, well, were we right? Were we wrong about this and that? And of course, one has always a rosy memory of how right we were, and we didn't make any mistake. Well, I'm not so sure, but I think that the emphasis on trust was well placed. That's certainly one thing, and we'll probably come back to this in our conversation. One of the reasons why some of the technologies, especially in their social impact, say during coronavirus, the app and so on, have not delivered as well, put mildly, as we were expecting, was precisely because that emphasis on trust, which we put such a long time ago, has not yet been absorbed as a fundamental point. The best technology in the world will not work if people do not trust the providers, the system, the technology itself. So trust was a good move, and I think we got it right at the time. I think at the time, it's unbelievable that we've been doing this for several years now. There was a lot of emphasis on data protection, GDPR, inevitably, much less as we move on through time, much less on artificial intelligence. I think that is something that has grown into something crucial, as important as data protection, to put it generally. So now, say, compared to 4 years ago, we really walk on two legs, if you like. One is the data, and therefore also the information, fake news, all that comes with that. And the other leg is the algorithms, the agency that we have around us, increasingly doing more, the independence, the autonomy of those algorithms, and so on. So I think that was not so clearly visible at the time. Of course, the discussion has become, as the horizon has approached, a more and more important feature of our discussion. So that's the couple of points that I certainly pick up from the past.
It's fascinating. It's always interesting to look back, but perhaps we can also think about where we are today as well before we look into the future and the present, and perhaps what's happened or what's happening right now, and I suppose where it's happening. So, as you heard yesterday, we were looking at some of the lessons we need to learn from 2020, and to me, 2020 was a year where ethics came or met an emergency. You know, it was brought into play in quite a year like no other that none of us expected. So I'd be interested in your views of how do you think we did? How do you think the digital ethics community or the digital as an issue, rather, not the community, but as an issue did? And what do you think the lessons we need to learn yourself from this year, particularly in terms of, things like the COVID app and other issues and experiences that we've seen this year? So how do you think we've done this year?
I think it's a fiction, to be honest, and very well on some fronts, but not as well as we should and could have done on other fronts. Let me be a bit more specific than that. 2020 seems to me really the time when our century has begun, to put it dramatically. So the 21st century has started with a pandemic. All the past years were a long 20th century. We were doing things as always. It was more of the same. The impression is that we are experiencing a watershed, sort of a point of change. Not because what we're experiencing in digital ethics and with digital technology is different from what it was like 2 years ago, but because now it's in every house, in the mind of everybody. It is almost like a synchronization of interest, of impact across the globe. That is because we have to run away from the biosphere, from the office and everyday life, and into the, call it, infosphere. All of a sudden, everybody depends on technology. Technology is what enables kids to go to school, so to speak, people to work, entertainment, food delivery. Everything comes through that particular technology. So the world has synchronized in a way that was not synchronized before. Now that has made digital ethics more obvious in front of everybody in terms of saying, oh, are we doing the right thing? Is this what we want? Is this society we want to build? So it has been a great opportunity. Did we grasp that opportunity? Partly. I don't think well enough. It was a bit of a disappointment. It could have been a great sort of dress rehearsal, so to speak, of the joining forces of the green of all our habitats and the blue of all our technologies. No, a manager have been sort of promoting for a while. It didn't quite work as well as we thought it could. I mean, AI, for example, has been marginal in helping us to deal with coronavirus. All the technologies we have had to be massively improved. Imagine only just the online communication and so on. And just to conclude, I mean, the app was hugely a disappointment, not just in terms of the technology, but also in terms of disorganization, everybody going his own way. Things just in terms of continental Europe. No, we had apps all over the place, but even in the UK, we had an app not for Scotland, but not the same app, maybe for NHS. Now, that going solo is not a good idea. And then last point, maybe, that a lesson learned the hard way, not that it wasn't there to be learned, but perceived by everybody, is digital sovereignty. All of a sudden, we realized the obvious, that some of the bits of things that we need to do can only be done if you give the key of the house to the big companies. The app is one example. I mean, the UK tried to do independently something that dependent on the API of Google, Apple, and so on. Didn't quite work for obvious reasons. Now, not that I like the idea, but realizing that that's what's happening now, that is essentially fundamental decisions are at the societal level are in the hands of big companies, is an important step, so that we can start thinking, is this what we want? Is this the right way of doing it? How we can collaborate and coordinate? Now, that would not have happened without the pandemic, and now we have some problems to solve.
So it'd be quite interesting to see and to understand, I suppose, have there been things in 2020 that have pleased you? Or have you seen progress? We talked about yesterday, actually in our opening session, around what progress we have seen this year in terms of more organizations operationalizing ethics and of course the importance of making sure we get that right at scale. But I'm just interested in has there been work or progress that you've seen in 2020 that has really, you've kind of seen or has really pleased you, perhaps?
Plenty of things, and we all have our own special sort of projects or initiatives. This was really very good. Or finally something done properly. So my own selection is as any other. I like to maybe put in two baskets. One, we're not doing anymore something that it was a waste of time, which is good, and something that we're doing the right way. So the waste of time that has stopped, seems to me. A couple of things. I mean, we're no longer seeing discussion dominating the world. That was always a distraction. I think it's important that we move on, and we have. I mean, you don't find journalists talking about this any further. But also the other thing that has kind of stopped, which is good, is the proliferation of declaration, list of principles, new manifesto, and so on, which was very good, but it was mushrooming all over the place. And I don't know, last time I checked, we had reached the 100, 115 list of principles. Do we need 151, 57, 213? Clearly not. So at the two extremes, too much production of principles of all kinds and too much worries about sci-fi scenarios, likely, we're becoming more real. Now, that's the real technology, the real problems, the everyday business that unfortunately, but luckily, in a way, we finally engage with. So, and that's the good news. So just to give you an example, recently I discussed an initiative taken by Helsinki and Amsterdam on an open register for AI. It's a great initiative. I mean, they put there several projects already. It's AI in the ordinary sense, what you use for car park, for book return libraries, work in progress on the road, etc. Citizens can go check, they can actually check what data these machine learning services have been trained on, they can comment. That's the everyday life sort of AI that we need to develop, discuss, improve. That is a wonderful context where things have really moved on. And I think that maybe, if I may add, there's less of a laissez-faire or free market, cowboy attitude in terms of anything goes. I think society has raised the bar about expectations, and there's a lot of pressure now, antitrust. Just look at what has happened yesterday, today to Facebook, or another fine to Google. And I'm not a fan of that kind of approach. I think we should regulate first and establish a clear framework, not keep going in terms of punishing this and punishing that. But clearly, the society at large, not just in the UK, in Europe, in the United States, has raised the bar. It expects more from digital companies. And I think digital companies are ready to deliver more. So that is good news.
I suppose that leads us on to perhaps what we might see in 2021 and looking beyond and looking ahead into the future, because that's, forgive me, I wanted to get your reflections on what we've seen in the year that we are, have seen this year, but really what we were looking and hoping you would do is help us, Luciano, to think about what we really need to think about and have on everyone's top of their agendas and their to-do lists for 2021. So looking ahead into next year, let's start with what some of the key issues and challenges you see coming ahead in 2021, and perhaps how do you think we can be, or what advice would you give to people? How can we be ready, and perhaps not by surprise, or not surprised by what we might face next year?
I think there's something coming that is probably obvious to anyone on this call, but not so much to people outside of this call. We know that regulation is coming, and it may, of course, be an improvement, revision of the GDPR and equivalent sort of instruments, legally speaking. But I have in mind especially AI of all kinds, from the robotics kind, say driverless cars and so on, to the more software-oriented AI as a service and how to regulate that. Now, this is not going to be easy, of course, but there's one other point there that I think is becoming increasingly obvious to anyone, and that's auditing. The mechanism is quite simple. We've seen this happening so many times before. You have a new sector emerging, and the sector starts having discussions, sometimes also about ethics, standards, principles, framework, regulations, compliance. What kind of compliance? Who decides whether someone is complying or not? Auditing. Auditing becomes the means whereby you check and certify that, say, a particular actor is doing the right thing according to the rules. Is a bit like not checking whether everybody's playing in the right way according to the textbook. Now, that auditing has been in the making for some time. Certainly in my own corner, I've been in the interaction that I had with the European Commission, with the Council of Europe, with companies in the auditing business. They're all either thinking about doing it or already doing it. Now, at this stage, auditing is more of a self-imposed choice. A company may decide to not go for an ethics auditing or checking, am I doing the right thing in the right way with my AI tools, etc. But it is coming close to becoming something that will be expected, and then at some point a matter of compliance. Now, what does that mean for anyone who wants to anticipate these steps? The future is open and flexible, we all know that. But if you start seeing something that becomes increasingly likely, you can prepare now. So being ready for a stage when that auditing will come your way, and therefore you don't have to start from scratch or redo everything because you didn't think about it. Well, that's something that we can do now. So I would invite anyone who is in the field and as a stakeholder of one kind or another to start thinking, how would I position myself next year? Assuming that auditing is either already there or coming my way, and therefore it's not just something I can choose to do or not, but increasingly something that society will expect and perhaps become compulsory compliance, as I said, at the legal level. That seems to me one of the major trends that we're looking at. The other one, maybe if I have a second, is more AI for social good. AI is becoming now something ordinary, a bit like electricity in the house. I don't particularly like the oil data kind of analogy. I think it's more misleading than helpful. But AI as a form of agency is becoming increasingly something that you use on tap for, say, your voice recognition service because you have a restaurant. Okay, so something ordinary. In that respect, something that can also be thrown at social and environmental problems that we have, that could be something that I don't necessarily expect, but I would welcome very much. Again, future open, depends on our decisions now. If we were to decide to go in that direction, I think it will be a good future. So AI for social good, I would love to see more happening in that corner.
Maybe I can just ask you a little bit more on that in terms of, is there any particular key challenge or issue or mission that you would apply AI for social good to, that you think could really make a difference in 2021? Where would you start?
I think that there are some obvious candidates. I mean, we've also seen recent discussions with colleagues in digital ethics and that polemic with terrible events with Google and so on. Climate change. We have a monster of disaster happening under our own eyes. Once the pandemic is over, that will stay, and it has not gone away. It will just increase as we speak as a massive problem. AI as a force for good thrown at that could do a lot of good. Now, mind that this is also, so AI against climate change is also a bit of a gambit, to use a chess analogy. So it's a bit of a risk that we're taking, because of course all we do with digital technologies runs on energy. We cannot forget that is electricity, electricity, electricity. So using something that is so impactful in terms of consumption of energy to fight climate change, it seems to be almost a contradiction. Now, look, you're just adding problems to problem. Not so if you think that you have a small sacrifice at the beginning for a bigger gain at the end. That is the balance act that we need to have, the sort of trade-off. So if we are able to develop an AI which has a light impact and is massively helpful in terms of fighting climate change, then we are on the right track. And just to be more concrete, what do you mean by all this? Do more with less, do better with what you have, and do differently. So it's efficiency, efficacy, innovation. These three topics make the difference. For example, Google, classic textbook example, cut 30% of their energy consumption because they use DeepMind algorithms to maximize and optimize the energy consumption. Or we just recently news everywhere, folding a protein through AI. So, what's the big deal there? Well, that is the basis of medical research. So obviously, this is amazing in terms of what we could do to have not entrepreneurial goodwill to do this, the intelligence, the research and development, and so on, but also some rules around us that facilitate that interaction between research and development at the university level, in companies, and so on. So all this scenario, what can be done, and how you facilitate what can be done, that seems to me a beautiful 2022, 23 that I would really welcome finally.
And I think, thanks for that, Luciano. And I think those issues around the role of technology, AI, and how you do it in an ethical, responsible way around the road to net zero is something that we are discussing at one of the breakout sessions after our session, COP26, digital and the road to net zero. So I'm sure those issues will come up there. So thanks for kind of giving us a bit of a teaser of some of the issues we may need to think about there during that session. If I could just bring you back to, you talked about auditing and talked about compliance, and I'm wondering whether that the role of auditing, whether you think that is perhaps a key to the term we heard quite a lot yesterday around operationalizing ethics, but at scale, and how we kind of scale up the operationalizing of ethics principles and frameworks, as you talked about, that we've seen a lot of codes over the years. Do you think therefore the audit is, or the audit approach is the way to do that? Do you think that's a key to operationalizing ethics at scale?
I think that yes, and I think that that's the way it's going to go. So if you think about the whole debate on ethical principles, there's a bit of a naive view sometimes, again, not in this group, our side, which imagine that you got a good ethical framework and then you just apply that, translate that into practice, boom, job done. That's not the way it works normally. Never. What the ethical debate, the framework does, is to prepare the ground for legislation. So think in terms of something we've seen happening, the GDPR. The GDPR didn't sort of come out of the blue one day. It was preceded by a long, detailed, boring, painful debate on what society would we want, what kind of protection you want to have on the data, etc. That was an ethical debate. Then when you read the GDPR, essentially there's almost no reference to ethics. Human dignity, as far as I remember, appears once in a marginal sort of reference. So there is no ethics in the GDPR? Of course not. But that is what prepared that particular piece of legislation. Now, I'm using the GDPR because we're all well acquainted with it and it has been around for some time. So imagine now something similar happens for AI, say just in the UK. Have an ethical debate going on for some time. Finally, that informs the legal framework, which therefore is ethically sound, generates a socially preferable society. That is the instrument, auditing, blah, 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 all the rest. That is what happens usually with the relationship between ethics and law. Ethics gives, as it were, law a perspective, and then the law generates the rules, and the rules have some real grip, hit the ground. I wouldn't expect ethics to do all the work all the way down to transforming, say, behavior of major actors and so on. So there is a bit of a few steps in between. That's why the ethical debate is so important, but it's also a mistake to think that that's all we need to have. And translating ethics into practice, I think, is missing the fundamental pieces of gear there that make that translation doable. Now, the legal context, the auditing, and so on. Mm. If you add all those pieces, well, yes, then you have the whole mechanism, and that works.
Mm. So fascinating, but so let's just touch on therefore the kind of, which you touched on slightly, the role of legislation, regulation. So I'm interested in terms of your view of your level of confidence, perhaps, whether policy, legislation, regulation in this area, in AI or ethics, can get this right? Or where do you think regulation or legislation is needed, or is the answer? Where do we need movement then? Is there any particular or what type of legislation or regulation do you think we may need, or we may be not that we may need, but that we may be facing in the future?
Well, the legislation has let me start by saying that I have some mild optimistic view of legislation doing the right if we are careful. So it's not just about oh, it will be fine. Not necessarily. I mean, it could go wrong easily. I mean, we could have the wrong legislation that makes a mess of innovation, that transforms all the wrong things in something that is no longer financially interesting and so on. But we can do a good job. So the possibility is there, and it's a wide space of success that we can walk into. One thing that we should probably, at least seems to me, expect is the end of a couple of narratives here. One is that innovation is untouchable. No. In other words, innovation is kind of a holy cow. Any innovation, whatever innovation, is always good. That's not true. We know that that is not true. There's innovation that is socially good, that is good for the environment, that is good for economy, that is welcome. And some innovation sometimes is not so good. It's something that we could do without. So innovation as if you were the only untouchable in the discussion about legislation. I wouldn't expect that to be the case 21, 22 as we move on. And the other thing is to stop thinking that legislation is in the chasing job of following and catching up with innovation, with digital transformation. It is not the case. No. Legislation, rules, framework, whatever we want to call them, even self-imposed, are always in terms of steering, determining the direction of traveling, not how fast you get there. I have to say, I've been saying this for some time, so forgive me if I repeat myself, but we need to detach the idea that how fast digital technology develops, which is immensely quickly, versus in which direction we want to go. Because if we like the direction, then we can go there even more quickly. Now, we will love that. Sometimes we don't have a clear sense of direction, therefore we're worried. Oh, what is the break here? How can we slow down? It's not a matter of slowing down. It's a matter of having clear ideas of where we want to go. So say, for example, about fake news or forms of bullying that are by now on live, a bit online, a bit offline, the misinformation about the virus, but not only, and so on. These are things that we do not necessarily like in our society. They are more of a problem than a solution. So possibly some kind of understanding of how freedom of speech can go hand in hand with a good ecology of information, or something that we have resolved in other contexts. Now, I'm not suggesting, and at that point, I'm not suggesting we import solutions from the past. That's not the way it works. But we can work out, not like, oh, we did this in the past, therefore we do it again. But we can work out a bit of an equation. In the past, there was a problem, and there was a solution. Today, this is the problem, and this is the solution. So A to B and C to D. Take the newspapers. I mean, we have a certain environment in terms of fake news there. So we solve that problem for that environment. That gives us some hope that we can solve this problem for this environment. This is doable. And I think that UK and Europe at large are at the forefront in this debate. So I will be optimistic, mildly, I said.
Now, we talked about that quite a bit, and you may have heard in my recap of the day we had the panel on the democracy in the age of AI. So we talked a lot about misinformation, disinformation, and we know that those are really some big challenges, as you touched on there, around disinformation. And then we talked yesterday about the way that disinformation, misinformation can be amplified. And I'd be interested in your views of perhaps if you were on that panel, what would you have raised in terms of how should we address some of those really big, challenging issues, democracy in the age of AI? And you had started to touch on it there, but I'm interested in your views. Do you think, is this a technology problem or a policy issue? How do you see that debate going forward in terms of finding, or can we, find a solution to these issues?
I think there's at least three variables. So solution here. No, you mentioned two already. Is a technological problem. Sometimes we just need a technological solution. That is straightforward. And imagine what happens today, for example, on platforms when it comes to copyright infringement or pedophilia. I mean, we have the means and the tools to spot it, block it, cease and desist, and so on. So sometimes it is just and I put just ironically a huge but technological problem, which means that it's a policy. The technology follows the policy. I mean, it's not that technology has its own will and decides to start spotting, pedophilia cases along that. There's a policy that says, no, please, implement this kind of technology, developing more incentives and so on. I think there's also a third element, which is what exactly business models promote in terms of both the technology and the policy. It can't be just a matter of, say, the computer scientist and the politician. No, the major role there is the business person who says, well, thank you, computer scientist, thank you, politician. Now I have to make this work. And any hand here, any help here? So I think that if you look at this triangle of policy, of technology, and crucially important business management, governance of business policies in the sense of strategies, then we have the stakeholders that need to be sort of brought to the table to understand how to solve this together. And that's the other point. Then it becomes much more doable. Each his own way, or it's just a tech problem, or it's just a policy, or no, it's just a business model. Then we don't get a solution. Once again, the UK is in a good position because that dialogue happens more frequently here than in continental Europe, for example. So pressure, but at the same time, optimism here to do better, because this is a context where things can happen more easily.
No, absolutely. And, things like the summit, I think, help with these discussions and help with these. Exactly. But of course, it happens throughout the year, and throughout all the different amazing work that happens in this community during the year. So wonderful analogy of your triangle. Perhaps the one group that isn't in the triangle is the public, perhaps. And I think we touched on yesterday around the importance of trust and confidence. And I found it fascinating yesterday, not just in our opening sessions, but in a lot of the breakouts where what was reflections on 2020 was that the conversation is now perhaps more mainstream than it ever was. So we talked about that these issues are being discussed around the dinner table, people marching in the streets around issues. So there has obviously been an increase in public awareness, public debate, perhaps around the role of data, of technology, and then the ethical issues around accountability, transparency, explainability this year. But I think we've also personally seen a bit of a hit to public trust and confidence as well from what we've seen in 2020 across the board. So to me, rebuilding or looking at how we rebuild public trust and confidence, particularly if we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, in the impact of these technologies on our democracy, to me seems to be a really key issue for 2020 and 2021. Sorry, and I wondered if you'd agree, and if so, how do you think we need to recreate or rebuild public trust in information and in democracy, in technology? Do we have what we need? We talked about the UK is in a good position. Do we have the architectures, the mechanisms in place? And do you think this is going to be a key issue for us in 2021? And if so, do we have a clear sense of what society is looking for? What do we need to build on, given what we've seen this year?
I think we have a great opportunity. Now, we started this conversation by looking at the past years and the emphasis on trust years ago, and that emphasis has only increased, and today is even more there. And if you like, that trust or that desire and demand for trust hasn't been met yet, not fully at least. So there is a necessity by all, not just the policy, but the decision makers in all corners, from the big companies to big government, from city council to, say, even university, if you like, in my own words, to gain and improve trust. It can be done by emphasizing at least two elements that make trust something possible. One is transparency. Now, I can trust you if I see what you're doing. The other one is accountability. I can trust you if I know that if you not do something wrong, there's a penalty at the end of it. Of course, not you, you, the in-person. So transparency and accountability are the two things that we need to increase in our society if we want to start getting to the good cycle where more trust. The other point that I would like to stress here, and I'm always worried about talking too much about concepts, because people think, oh, no, but this is all abstract, how reality. But remember, concepts are what enable us then to do good design of what we have in our hands. It's like the architect first and then the engineer for the house. So in terms of blueprint of the kind of society we want to have, we need to remember that trust is not something that people want to exercise all the time. If you trust someone, there is another way of saying, I don't have to take care of this anymore because I trust you to take care of it for me, instead of me, better than me. If I trust you to do X, it means that I'm not checking all the time that you're doing X properly, accurately. So trust is a way of delegating someone to do something for you. If we keep this in mind, that's why accountability, transparency, and delivering are fundamental. If we have actors out there that fail to be transparent, fail to be accountable, fail to deliver, well, surely, next thing you know, society says, well, I'm sorry, but I cannot delegate anything to you. I have to do it myself. So some of the discussions we see in the street, some of the protests behind have this sense of, oh, not again, now I have to take care of it myself because I cannot trust the politician, the business, the agency, the actor that should have done this instead of me. Now, that infringement of trust, therefore, is hugely expensive. And that's the last point I want to make. It generates friction. It makes everything more cumbersome, more laborious, because everybody has to take care of that particular business, whatever that is, again and again and again. So trust generates efficiency. It means that we can do more with less. Now, if only we could implement this in terms of rules, then, or say, behavior, then we would be much more nimble. Imagine now, just to touch on a recent event, 1st of January, Brexit is around the corner. We don't yet know what's going to happen. Whatever is going to happen, if we could have more trust among all parties involved, then a lot of tariffs, a lot of friction, a lot of problems, including not in the digital world, say just data transfer and so on, would be much easier, would be less expensive, it would be good for business, good for society, good for the environment. Now, this can be done, but we need to make sure that the actors involved start from the very ABC. Transparency, accountability, delivering. Then I can trust you.
Absolutely interesting. And I suppose it's how do we then get those things right, but also make sure that people are involved, right? And that society is part of this discussion and part of this conversation. So how do we, and we talked yesterday about, I'd be interested in your views about whether we need to reframe this debate and discussion then. Do you think do we need to do that with society as well and with people? Do we need to kind of perhaps in early 2021 think about the conversation and where society and the public then fit into that to get that balance right? Because it is, trust is part of society and people being able to make decisions and have control about how their information or data is used, as well as trusting others, right? So to what extent or how much do you put society into this conversation? Do we need to reframe this to get this right?
I think it's crucial to have society there, but not just for sort of rhetorical reasons, but that's where we can start improving the whole system. When we talk about public engagement, we do that all the time. Then you scratch the surface, and often that public engagement is sometimes just perfunctory. But when it is something serious, it's one way. It's explaining to the public how it is, how it works, what we're doing. Is engagement in terms of bringing the public with you and making sure that the public is informed, the public is able to see through it, etc. That is absolutely fine. It's great, and it's only half the story. The other half, which we should do much more and much more locally, in a sort of fine-grained level, is listen to the public. What are the real problems that people have? Because one of the things that we've seen in recent years, since we started this initiative, is that some wonderful ideas just don't hit the ground because they were either premature, uninteresting. And I'm talking about trivial things. You transform the car park at the west, pay through mobile phone, credit card only. That's insane because half the population doesn't have the right mobile phone, doesn't have no credit card. So what could have been like an intelligent, forward-looking initiative turns out to be a big problem. What the public wants is, for example, certain kind of hours less expensive than other hours, and so on. So the listening moment is that pinch, and I hope no one will be upset in what I'm going to say now, is that little pinch of populism that is the good kind of populism. Listen to the public, say, in terms of digital services and data protection and what AI is there for you so that you understand what works and what doesn't. And when I say a pinch, is exactly what we mean by inflation in economics. 2% is good for the economy. 2% of populism, 2% of not just going by telling people the way it is, but listen, try to understand, get a grip of locally that matters, and it doesn't matter elsewhere. So it can't be a policy everywhere, not in, say, Manchester or London. Well, it's different populations, different needs, different sort of social backgrounds, and so on. So back to what I was saying before, is public engagement, the public being, society being part of the solution, is not just in terms of course, we have to bring on board Mary and Peter otherwise. No, we need to listen. Even when we don't like it, even when they're going to say something like, oh, I hope that was not going to be a problem anymore. Well, welcome to the real politics that works.
Well, Luciano, I think we've only got a minute or two left before we have to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you unfairly, forgive me, please, but we fascinating conversation and lots of food for thought, and particularly on listening to the public. That's something we'll definitely catch up on the public engagement and democracy breakout panel, which is coming up straight after this. So just to close us off, perhaps very briefly, and again, forgive me, but this has really given us a lot of interesting issues for 2021. But where's the one issue or one area that you think we really need to get right, or we really need to move forward in 2021, that will really, when we get to the end of next year and we come back together again, that we can say, look at what we've achieved, or look at the progress we've made? What's the one area you would highlight to everybody as key?
I think with a little trick, I would say that it's an area with two sides. So I'll give you two. One side and the other side of the coin. They are connected. Sustainability on the one hand and social inequality on the other. That's what digital technologies must make a massive difference starting from yesterday. It is unacceptable in a country like the UK not to be at the forefront in both cases. Now, sustainability is, as we heard recently, green policies and so on, is good for the environment, good for business, good for society. It is totally doable. The major engine there is digital technologies. As I said, efficiency, efficacy, innovation. These three things, massively useful there. Social inequality. We cannot live in a country where people have to queue for food. This is inconceivable. Not in the UK for the 21st century, not in the UK going forward. One of the richest countries in the world, one of the countries that has given civilization abundantly, through it again and again, to the history of humanity on this planet, cannot afford to have the social inequality that we have around the corner. And I'm talking from also one of the places where that inequality is perhaps more visible sometimes. So again, in that case too, digital technology in terms of understanding, doing more, and fine-tuning the right policies where money really goes a long way and makes a big difference, and who should pay for what, etc. That is hugely beneficial. In both cases, I see digital technologies as an enormous, powerful tool for make a good difference. So I'm afraid it's a coin with two sides, if I may get away with that metaphor.
You, of course, can get away with that, Luciano. That was amazing and a fascinating conversation. So thank you
Always a
so
pleasure.
much. Always giving us so much to think about and so much to challenge us as well to get right as we move forward. Thank you, Luciano, so much for being with us today. And I know people could hear you loud and clear if unfortunately the technology and the camera let us down. But thank you so much for being with us today. Really
Thank
do
you.
appreciate it.